Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker from this morning. And this is Professor Neil Humphry, who is Professor of Psychology of Education from the University of Manchester and Head of the Manchester Institute of Education, also at the University of Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Morning. So before I start, I'd like to say two things. One is I think this is extremely timely conference. It's a delight and an honour to be here. The second is just to say how impressed I've been with the foregrounding of young people's lived experience alongside the kind of what you normally get at a conference, which is boring academics like me talking. We could do a lot more as researchers to bring lived experience into the work that we do so that mental health isn't reduced to numbers on a page. Having said that, almost all of my presentation is about numbers on a page, so please bear with me. Before I start, I'd like to plea. I don't know what is there, about 200 people in the room. I'm running the half marathon next month for an incredible cause. So if you could sponsor me, I would be grateful. Even if just 10 or 20 of you sponsor me, whatever you can spare. The link is there, but it's also pinned on my Twitter feed. So please do sponsor me. It's for an incredible cause. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 things, and I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the time, so we might have to whiz through a few of them. One is to briefly touch on what we mean when we talk about mental health and pick up on some of the discussion earlier around the distinction between mental health difficulties and well-being, where the overlaps are and so on. What some of the factors are associated with variability in mental health and well-being. To also look at what the evidence can tell us about whether mental health difficulties in particular are increasing among children and young people, whether that indeed means then that there is a crisis. There's a lot of talk of a crisis in child and adolescent mental health. And then to kind of conclude by looking at why schools have become a central focus in this area, and then particularly this notion of evidence-based practice. And I'm going to be quite controversial and critical in relation to that last question, not because I don't believe in evidence-based practice, and indeed I'm an inside voice in that sense. I'm part of the body of people that produce some of this evidence, but we need to be careful and we need to be critical about some of the assumptions we make when we conduct research in this area. Okay, so let's start with mental health difficulties. There's a piece of work which was published nearly 17 years ago now by Shea and colleagues, which has stayed with me, and I use it in my teaching and I use it at almost any conference where I talk about mental health. It's basically an irreverent piece by Shea and colleagues called Psychopathology in the 100-Acre Wood, which immediately by the title grabs you, doesn't it? Much more interesting than a usual academic article. What Shea and colleagues were attempting to do was to demonstrate that there are mental health archetypes in our popular media, and particularly they focused on how some of the diagnostic labels that we apply might actually be readily applied to some of A.A. Milne's characters. So, for example, Tigger is gregarious, he's energetic, and he's also extremely impulsive. There's one particular story where Tigger decides he's going to go and taste every mushroom and every in the 100-Acre Wood. No thought as to the consequences, no thought as to, well, this actually might poison me. He just decides he's going to go and do it. Now, how similar does that sound to children and young people who we label as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that impulsivity, acting before thinking and so on? Might also apply to Eeyore, to Pooh Bear, who might also have some form of special educational needs. Don't laugh, he's nice. But he is described by A.A. Milne as a bear of very little brain. Rabbit, possibly. Actually, somebody corrected me on this. I gave a presentation where I used this analogy a few weeks ago, and somebody corrected me. So I said rabbit potentially has dyslexia because of the signs in the 100-Acre Wood are quite often misspelled, but apparently it's owl that creates those signs, so I do apologise. Piglet is potentially a kind of a case study in anxiety, but we can't stop there. We also have to go to The Simpsons. So Bart Simpson, so Nelson Muntz, first of all, if you look at the criteria for conduct disorder in children and young people and then watch any episode of The Simpsons with Nelson Muntz in it, he's a classic case of a conduct disordered child. He's aggressive, he's a bully, he's physically intimidating, he steals, he does all the things. He's basically, the list of signs for conduct disorder is Nelson Muntz personified. Bart Simpson, there's actually an episode of The Simpsons where Bart Simpson's diagnosed with ADHD. If you've not seen it, it's worth looking up. It's an absolutely superb satire on America's obsession with medicating children and young people. So these are some of the kinds of difficulties that we're thinking of when we talk about mental health difficulties. The more kind of academic, I suppose, definition, we talk about changes in thought, mood, and or behaviour that impair functioning, that impair our ability to lead the kinds of lives that we want to lead. And we know that these kinds of difficulties lead to reduced quality of life for young people, lost economic productivity. If you have mental health difficulties, you're less likely to be in work, destabilisation of communities, and higher rates of education, health and social care utilisation. The cost was estimated about 7 years ago to be about £105 billion annually. The cost of mental health difficulties, care for mental health difficulties, is almost certainly a lot higher than that now. The really worrying thing is that by 2030, just depression, so ignoring all of those other difficulties, just focusing on depression, that will yield the highest disease burden for high-income countries. So they do this thing called looking at disability-adjusted life years, which is the number of quality life years lost as the result of a disabling condition. And 10% of disability-adjusted life years by 2030 will be due to depression. That's higher than heart disease, that's higher than obesity. Okay? So there is a very clear and significant rationale for attending to this. We also know that up to 20% of children and young people worldwide, but probably in the UK, probably 1 in 10, depending on where you draw the line, are affected. And we know that half of adult cases originate in childhood or adolescence, and 75% originate by age 24. So if you're ever going to have mental health difficulties, you will have your first onset in 3/4 of cases by the time you're 24. So again, there's a significant rationale for focusing on early intervention. And we also know there's an increase from childhood to adolescence. What about the flip side? What about well-being? Well, well-being's a little bit more tricky, I think. It's summed up really nicely by Earhart and Whiting 10 years ago, where they did a review for the Department for Education because well-being was appearing in lots of DFE policy documents. So they commissioned essentially a discourse analysis. How is well-being defined by the people that use the term? And they said, essentially, it's a cultural construct that represents a shifting set of meanings. It's no more or no less than what any one group of people collectively agree makes a good life. A more recent definition provided by Jess, who's here and will be speaking to you this afternoon, that's directly drawn from the views of children and young people, is about them feeling good, feeling that their life is going well, and that they are able to get on with their daily lives. So that's drawn from the perspective of children and young people. We can make the distinction between subjective and objective measures of well-being. So objective measures are the ones that are taken by, for example, UNICEF. So they do their report card on well-being every 5 or 6 years, and they apply criteria to do with infant mortality and various other objective indicators. But the problem with those is they're decided by a group of experts. So subjective measures have been described as being more democratic. So subjective measures are based on not what any one expert or group of experts considers to be well-being, but it's the young person's subjective view of their own lives. And there's further ways that we can kind of split that down into affective and cognitive well-being and various other components, but it's essentially that idea of a quality of life as defined by the individual. But these are not two kind of polar opposites. One's not just the flip side of the other. A colleague of mine, Pravitha Patley, who's at the University of Liverpool, did a piece of work which was published last year. There's been an equivalent piece of work with an adult sample published also. And they basically took data from the Millennium Cohort Study. They looked at within which there's measures of mental ill health and there's also measures of well-being. And they looked at the overlap between the two, and they also looked at the factors that contributed to the two. And as you can see through this superb infographic that they produced, they've also published a very detailed journal article. But basically, certain factors are associated with both well-being and mental health difficulties. So, for example, engagement with school contributes significantly to young people's sense of well-being, but also contributes significantly to mental health difficulties. They found, though, that arguments with friends, my pointer's not working, yeah, there we go, arguments with friends was significantly associated with well-being, but not with mental health difficulties. So the point here is there are factors that contribute to both our sense of well-being and our mental ill health, and there are factors that contribute to one or the other, but not both. They're not, though, just two flip sides of the same coin. So both the child study, which I've included here, and the adult study demonstrated that it's possible to not experience mental health difficulties. That doesn't mean that you necessarily experience well-being, and vice versa. So the data is really quite clear on that. Okay, so how do we frame this idea of factors that are associated with variability in mental health? Well, one useful approach is this notion of risk and resilience. So the factors that increase the likelihood that we're going to experience mental ill health and the factors that might actually mitigate some of that risk. And one particularly useful approach, which is increasingly prevalent, is this idea of cumulative or multiple risk. So this is a graphic from the Good Childhood Report, which came out last week or the week before, the update of the Good Childhood Report. And this shows the impact of multiple disadvantage. So children who were exposed to multiple forms of disadvantage, socioeconomic disadvantage, family difficulties, so on and so forth. And the more of those factors that young people are exposed to, you see that significant increase in the proportion who experience, in this case, low well-being. And the data in most of these shows an almost exponential increase as the number of risk factors increases. So it's this idea of what's referred to as allostatic load. So each additional risk factor that a young person experiences creates stress, and there is a tipping point at which our coping resources are exhausted, and that's when we might be likely to experience an episode of mental ill health. Where the resilience perspective comes in is to look at what protective factors, what factors can be promoted, which actually might tip the balance in favour of positive outcomes. So there are factors that have been established in the research, so positive peer relationships. So even when young people are exposed to risk, if they have strong, healthy peer relationships, that can help them experience good mental health despite their exposure to adversity. Similarly, kids who feel a sense of connectedness to their school. So I'm going to show you, this is not published yet. This is from our Head Start pilot data set that Jess and myself and a couple of other colleagues have been working on, that just gives you an example of how risk and protective factors might interact with one another. So what we're measuring here is this is externalizing problems. So the Nelson Muntz, the behavioural, the conduct problems. And across the bottom of the chart, you see cumulative risk. So these risk factors are things like coming from a socioeconomically disadvantaged background, having special educational needs, being a child that's looked after or that's been removed from parent care, those kinds of things. And you can see that really sharp increase with each additional risk factor. So what we then did, though, with this data set, which is about just over 5,000 kids, is we also had data for each of the kids on, we did something called the Student Resilience Survey, which essentially assesses the extent to which they feel they have particular protective factors in their lives. For example, good relationships with their peers, an adult in school that cares about them, those kinds of things. So I'm going to split the data set up. So these are the young people who, the blue line is kids who have, they're referred to as assets on the chart, but essentially these are protective factors. So the kids who report having few or no protective factors or developmental assets, their behaviour problems are even higher. The reason the line doesn't continue all the way down is we don't have any kids where there are no cumulative risks and no protective resources. When we look at kids with slightly more developmental assets, the line drops again. And then kids who are what we would call asset rich, or who have access to multiple sources of protection, have the lowest scores of all. The only time that relationship breaks down is, where's my pointer, is the kids who are at the very highest levels of risk. There, the number of protective factors doesn't seem to differentiate those two groups. Again, that fits with that idea of allostatic load, the stress caused by exposure to multiple risk factors, so 6+ risk factors, is such that even with all the protective resources the young people have got, they're still experiencing difficulties. Okay, so are mental health difficulties among children and young people increasing? So Murphy and Fonagy talk about this popular perception that this generation of children and young people are more troubled and badly behaved than previous generations, and you see it in the media. I'm going to talk a little bit about the media in a little while. But it's become a little bit of a narrative. Things are worse for children now than they have ever been. So one of the things that I've been interested in is, well, before we look at the data on that, why might things have changed? What's changed in society that might have led to an increase in the prevalence of mental health difficulties? So we might look at some social changes. So we've got rising affluence but increased income inequality. I'm going to show you a nice graph in a minute that illustrates how that might impact on mental health. We've had some changes in family environment. We've had changes in technology, so children's exposure to screen time, the internet, social media, increased pressure in school, which I'm going to come back to. So all of these different things that various authors have proposed might be at the heart of any changes that we see in mental health difficulties. This is data from an international study reported in Wilson and Pickett's book, and it's essentially the correlation between income inequality in particular countries in the world and the prevalence of mental ill health. And you can see we're up there in terms of income inequality, and we're also up there in terms of prevalence of mental ill health. The USA is the forerunner, the most unequal society, and also the society with the most mental health difficulties. So this isn't a perfect relationship, but there is a significant correlation there. But we also need to be critical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social media, because social media seems to be the new folk devil. Okay, social media is just destroying children's lives, right? That's the narrative that we hear. So you'd be surprised potentially to hear a major review by Thrift, which was published about 2 months ago, that reviewed all of the literature that's available, all the scientific evidence on the connection between screen-based lifestyles, including social media, and the mental health of young people. What they found not only was that it wasn't necessarily detrimental to young people's mental health, that actually, in moderation, it could be very positive. So it increases social connections among young people. Those are different to the social connections that I had when I was a young person, but they are still valid social connections. They can help with homework, it can help young people establish their identity, it provides another forum through which they can seek help, etc. So there are some significant positive aspects to screen-based and social media lifestyles which kind of tend to get underplayed, but the research evidence is there. Where it can be very harmful is when it's extreme use. So what they found consistently was where there was extreme use of social media and kind of screen-based lifestyles, that's where the negative associations with mental health are to be found. But to kind of whitewash the whole thing and say social media and screen-based lifestyles are bad for young people is really not doing the evidence that's out there. It's doing the evidence a disservice. But you wouldn't think that if you read any of the newspapers. I really struggled to find, in preparing for this talk, I really struggled to find a single media story that said, do you know what, actually, Twitter and Facebook might be good for young people in some ways. They're all about, or Instagram or whatever the particular media, they're all about how damaging these things are. It's this kind of generational panic that we have. Okay? So what does the data actually tell us? There's not a massive number of studies on change in mental health difficulties over time. Certainly none that are, not many that are very recent, but there are a few. What we see up until the late 90s was significant increases in conduct problems, emotional difficulties among young people. Then, no significant change in Green et al.'s national study. That's been repeated, and I think that's going to be reported within the next year or so. What we do see, though, across the board, generally, the evidence suggests there isn't a huge increase in difficulty, but where there is in particular areas. In adolescence, and particularly emotional difficulties for female adolescents. That's where the evidence consistently points to an increase. So our colleague Elaine Fink, who's at Oxford, Bohr et al.'s international review, and also a piece of work published last year by Leshoff and colleagues, all point to increases over time in distress, anxiety, depression among adolescent females. There's also, for both sexes, been an increase in self-harm. So this is data from Bert's report to the government, which looked at hospital admission episodes for under-17s where self-harm was recorded as the cause. And that had nearly doubled in a 6-year period from 2009 to 2015. So increases, yes, but only in some specific areas. To suggest that across the board difficulties are increasing, again, isn't borne out by the data. Okay, let's turn to the media. So this was provided by our colleague Peter Fonagy, who's at the Anna Freud Centre. This is mentions of children's mental health in the published media. So, see if you can, there's a slight pattern. See if you can identify it. Okay? Our media have gradually become obsessed with children's mental health. Over time, from 2008, where there's barely a mention of children's mental health, to 2015, where there's over 1,000 mentions in UK newspapers. An absolutely exponential increase in reference to mental health. Same with CAMHS. Okay, so over time, this has become a media obsession. So if we come back to the idea of how and why children's mental health difficulties might be increasing, one is that it's everywhere. Okay, it's prevalent in our media. And in some ways, actually, that's a very good thing. You know, thinking about time to change, for example, what we're telling young people is it's okay to talk about these difficulties. Well, if we do that and if we try and reduce the stigma of talking about mental health difficulties, we might actually well see an increase. So an increase, even if where it's evident, female adolescents being an example, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It shows that young people are being more open about the difficulties they're experiencing. So an increase in difficulties where there is evidence for it is not necessarily a bad thing. So is there a crisis? Well, again, if you look at the media, it would be fairly clear. The media feel that there is a crisis. But the way for us to think about this, I think, is in two areas. So my colleague Terry Hanley, who's a counselling psychologist who works at Manchester with me, talks about this idea that, you know, if there's a crisis to be created, it's about the balance between need and provision. So if need rises, but high quality provision doesn't rise with it, you get an imbalance, okay? Well, the need's not necessarily rising, or certainly not rising across the board. It is in specific areas. But if you erode the provision, if you make it more difficult to provide effective support for young people through schools, through CAMHS, etc., then you don't need an increase in mental health difficulties to create a crisis. Need can stay the same, and if you erode provision, you'll still get a crisis. So we can start to look at things like the major cuts to CAMHS. We can start to look at things like the increases in the CAMHS referral thresholds. We can start to look at the fact that nearly a third of children referred to CAMHS weren't allocated a service in 2015, and so on and so forth. We can look at, well, where's the money gone? The 1.25 billion that was promised, which the first year's review showed most of which hadn't reached the front line. You can look at the swift removal of anybody that's critical of the overall approach. People like Natasha Devon, who was appointed as the mental health czar and then was quickly booted off for opening her mouth, for speaking out against the government. So all these different things that will show that the provision for young people's mental health is being gradually eroded over time. And a lot of that is filtering through schools as well, through education policies. So we've got this increased accountability culture in education. We had a proposal, which thank God they abandoned, to introduce academic testing for 4 and 5-year-olds in reception year. They piloted it. Of course, it was a disaster. What on earth are you going to test 4 and 5-year-olds on in terms of academics that's going to tell you anything reliable? That period of life is about readiness for school, the social and emotional and behavioural indicators that were referred to earlier on. So education policy has a role to play. And we've seen this turn to schools really quite recently. The SEN Code of Practice now explicitly references mental health. We've had numerous government documents, Future in Mind, the Green Paper that came out earlier this year. Schools as sites for promotion of mental health is not new. You could go back to SEAL, you could go back to TAMS, you could go back even to Every Child Matters. But the intensity of the focus on schools has reached a peak that I don't think we've ever seen before, which again makes this conference really timely. So I've got about 2 minutes, so I'm going to have to whiz through 3 minutes. I've got 3 minutes, wow. Which shows how badly I timed this whole presentation. So this is the main bit, right? So the main point of the presentation in the final 3 minutes, and I'm wasting even more time. So why have schools become a central focus? Well, they have extremely broad reach. They're pretty much the only universal service, really. They have a period of prolonged engagement. So young people in this country spend up to 15,000 hours in and at school. And they're also a central hub in most communities. Teachers are also the most commonly contacted mental health service. So our colleague Tamsin Ford, who's at Exeter, surveyed parents about who they would seek help from if their child was experiencing mental health difficulties. Class teacher was the most popular response, not doctor, not specialist, it was teacher, okay? And we also know research that we've just published at Manchester and that other colleges have published, children's mental health and their learning are interrelated. So this is data from a study of developmental cascades. So this is for girls. So this idea of sex differences comes to the fore again. So this is basically academic attainment once a year and mental health difficulties measured once a year. And for girls, we see this relationship between attainment and later internalising symptoms. So girls that struggle academically are much more likely to experience anxiety and depression a year later, even if you control for previous levels of mental health. For boys, what we found, and this is middle childhood, this is key stage 2, by the way. For boys, what we find is a very different relationship. Boys who have externalising difficulties, that erodes their academic performance a year later, but that relationship between attainment and internalising difficulties doesn't appear to be the same for boys. This is, as I said, after controlling for previous levels of difficulties, it's after controlling for a range of risk factors. Those relationships are really robust, but they're different for girls and boys in the sample that we studied. This is nearly 2,000 children. I'm going to skip measurement because Jess is going to talk about that this afternoon and talk a little bit in the final few minutes about early intervention. So schools can provide cost-effective, impactful interventions in this area. This is our PATH study, which we're just about to publish, cost-effectiveness analysis. Whether we like it or not, education's a marketplace right now. And so the idea of cost effectiveness is coming to the fore. So schools, our analysis of the PATH curriculum, but there are other analyses coming out that show that these kinds of interventions, you get your bang for your buck. They're not particularly costly. The impact is not huge, but because they don't cost a lot and they don't require a lot of time, they can still be cost effective. Evidence-based practice. So I said I would be critical. I've probably got about 30 seconds. A few elephants in the room. Yes, we should be mindful of evidence-based practice. Absolutely, of course we should. I'd be stupid to argue anything different, being somebody that generates some of that evidence. But we also need to be critical. For a start, we don't have the evidence for most mental health difficulties. So of the 30 most common difficulties experienced by children who see a child mental health specialist, we only have evidence-based guidance for less than half of them. So for more than half of children's difficulties, there isn't an evidence base or a high quality evidence base to draw upon yet. So we need to be a bit more creative. Even among those young people who are in receipt of an evidence-based approach, the data shows us that 1 in 3 will continue to experience ill health or actually will deteriorate. So it's not a cure-all. Other things. Well, schools we know, and this is changing somewhat, but schools don't actually make as much use as the research base as we would like. We did a survey of schools as part of the TAMS project about nearly 10 years ago now, so things may have changed. But we found only about a third of schools that actually made reference to any kind of evidence, not just randomised trials, any kind of evidence, when they talked about the decisions they made about their mental health support for young people. Other things, implementation. So this is a graph from our evaluation of the secondary SEAL initiative. We looked at changes in young people's conduct problems as a function of the quality of implementation of SEAL. And what we found was with low quality implementation, the schools where they didn't do very well, didn't do a very good job of implementation, conduct problems actually got worse. They were about the same over time for moderate quality, but for high quality implementation, that was where you see the significant kind of shift. So it's not just what you do, it's how well you do it. And then finally, where we draw these interventions from, we tend to import interventions from America and from other places. This is a graphic from a meta-analysis conducted by a colleague of mine that shows the difference in effect size for social emotional learning interventions when they're implemented in the country in which they originated and researched there, and when they're implemented somewhere else. So we call this the Guinness effect. So if anybody that drinks Guinness, I'm told, I don't know if it's an apocryphal tale, but I'm told that the best tasting Guinness is in Dublin, where it's made, and the further you get from Dublin, the worse it tastes. So there is some evidence to suggest that's the same for cultural translation of evidence-based interventions. Okay, take-home messages. School leads, kids' attainment and their mental health are related. Everything that you do has to reflect that. Policy makers, take with one hand and give with the other and nothing changes. We have got a major issue in relation to policy in education and policy in mental health. The two are kind of butting heads with one another. We look at increases in mental health provision, and at the same time, things are happening in education policy that are kind of directly bashing up against that. And finally, researchers, we know plenty about what works. We've got 1,000,001 databases of randomised trials. We're done on that front, I think. What we need to know more about from researchers is how, why, for whom, and in what context different interventions work. In 10 seconds that I've got left, and I do apologise for being over time. These are some resources. So these slides are going to be shared, right? So if I've done this right, and I may not have done, when you click on any of these little graphics, it should link you directly to the resource. So there's things like MindEd, the Anna Freud Centre have just launched the Never Too Young to Talk About Mental Health, the Early Intervention Foundation's guidebook. All these resources are already out there. They're already kind of drawing together the evidence that's available, but I'm constantly staggered by how few people actually are aware of them. So have a look at them. They can help you make the kinds of evidence-informed decisions that we're hoping that you will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions.
I think the final slide's interesting because it shows the wealth and the plethora of possible ways for schools to start researching how they can implement mental health support policies. The problem for schools is, as we all know, is that schools, as we've said several times this morning, have to do a million different jobs. How can schools go about narrowing down what's best for their school? How can they make good choices around that? And who's got the time to read all the evidence? Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Schools don't have time to read all the evidence, and I am a researcher. I don't have time to go and teach 30 kids for 7 hours a day. Some of those resources enable you to engage with the evidence without having to read all through it. So to give you a good example, so the Early Intervention Foundation's guidebook, which is one of a number of kind of similar types of guides, enables you to find the things that you want to focus on, the particular outcomes, narrow down to the age group of the kids that you teach, and then it actually provides you with a summary of the evidence. So it will tell you the strength of the evidence for this particular intervention is, definitive, promising, non-existent. Those kinds of resources are out there, and I think could be incredibly useful for schools if they only knew they existed, and if they only, but they're done very straightforwardly. So it doesn't require schools to go and read all the papers that populate the literature. People have already done that and kind of brought it all together in these kinds of online databases. It's just making sure that schools are aware that they're out there. And so when you're focusing on, well, are we going to adopt this particular intervention, go and have a look on that. Is it on any of these databases? If it is, what's the kind of state of the evidence to support it? And in some cases where you've got interventions that have been trialled multiple times, you can actually get even more kind of detailed evidence about, well, actually for schools in more deprived areas, less deprived areas, etc. So the evidence is out there, and these kinds of guidebooks and databases are really useful kind of handy ways into them to help you make your decisions.
Okay, I think we had another question over there, didn't we? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, very stimulating. I was really interested in the one that showed the anesthetic load that you were talking about. And I was interested to know whether you know how the externalising problems were measured. Is it STQ, or was there
In that particular one, it's measured by the Me and My Feelings measure, which was developed as part of the TAMS evaluation. It's essentially like it's a equivalent to the conduct problems scale on the SDQ, but it's a validated scale. It's predictive of, it does all the things that we would expect of a scale that measures mental ill health.
Is that still available?
Yeah, freely available, and the author of it is sitting there, and she'll be presenting to you this afternoon.
Hello.
Jess Dayton. Sorry for embarrassing you.
Okay, can we just sneak in one last question, because that lady there has had a hand up from the beginning, so we'll just do that and then we'll finish up.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that comprehensive presentation and appreciated the kind of nuance and self-awareness in it, which I think is often kind of lacking sometimes, and then not to Frederick Douglass, obviously. But I was wondering, you mentioned about kind of the differences in boys and girls.
Mm-hmm.
I assume what is the explanation behind that? I'm quite interested to know.
Yeah, no, it's the explanation that we put forward in the paper, like I said, that we've published, is it's about gender socialisation. So we explicitly and implicitly give different messages to boys than we do to girls about things like emotional expression, about academic motivation. You know, there's a whole literature on gender socialisation, and these kinds of effects that we're seeing fit with that perfectly. You know, we give different messages, whether we mean to or not, we give different messages to boys and girls particularly about the role that emotional expression should play in their lives. And I think that's where we're starting to see some of that come through in the gender differences we found. So it's purely about how we socialise boys and girls differently.
Okay, we must finish up there because I'm sure everyone is ready to go and get some lunch. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers this morning. In particular, our Time to Change Young Champions, who I thought provided us with such brave, honest and sometimes humorous accounts of their own experiences. So thank you to everyone this morning.